Yes, my name is Alejandro Camacho. I'm at University of California, Irvine School of Law, and I run the Center for Land, Environment, and Natural Resources. For now, starting in January, I'll be over a little bit closer. I'll be at UCLA Law School. I first want to thank and acknowledge and pay my respects to the Gabrielino Tongva people as the traditional caretakers of the land on which we're on today. I really do appreciate actually going after Emma and her sociological analysis of what is. My talk is really going to have a little bit more of a wider aperture, or maybe of some of the, not just the descriptive and analytical, but more of the normative about what the law, not just what the law is and its limitations, but what the law could be or might be, and some of the questions that are raised in that context. So I'll be talking about the governance and therefore the sort of ethical and political limitations related to the intentional release of biotechnology. Ooh. Yeah, likes that word, into the environment. All right, so to promote, obviously particularly to promote some conservation or human health goal. What I've been calling synthetic conservation, I understand, and it's interesting to me to use the term biotech beyond conventional conservation or containment. I'd like to explore more what the precise parameters are of that, and I appreciate Richard sort of talking about that. But I do wonder whether that's even the right frame for thinking about it. I guess I'll just lay out first sort of three big things I'd like to provoke in this context that I wonder whether they might be a little bit overlooked or left out in the conversation so far, and then I'll explain what I mean a little bit more about that. So the first one is really that I think this conversation really would profit a lot from the engagement with expertise and data from the literature on governance and institutional design. Not just on regulation of technology, not just what other countries are doing, but more generally. There's a lot to learn from that literature about how we design institutions. I just don't think that that's been part of the conversation. I could be wrong, but I certainly haven't seen it as much, except when I try to raise my hand. The second thing is really that we need to be aware that the legal ecosystem in this particular context is not just the coordinated framework. Frankly, it's just one part of the broader regulatory ecosystem that we're dealing with. And I think that that's often forgotten. And then third, that the issues with the legal system are not just sort of regulatory constraints on market efficiency. There are, I think, many more fundamental issues that are raised by it, including what are we even doing here and to what end, okay? So we might expect that the laws on deployment of biotechnology into conservation areas would focus on the trade-offs of a particular strategy for advancing some public goal, ecological health, biodiversity. Of course, those are very complex terms. But that's not even close to, there's no wrestling even with that. The focus on certainly U.S. biotechnology governance is on risk management and containment of products. And the focus of U.S. natural resources law, which is fundamentally part of the conversation when you're talking about no longer about containment, are largely based on dividing biological phenomena between those that are considered natural and those that are considered man-made or human-made, or alternatively between those that are labeled native and others that are labeled exotic or invasive or non-native. So I want to talk more about this governance ecosystem that we have. Sorry, I should stay by the mic. I want to lay out sort of just three different terms that I use for breaking down governance in general and thinking about it. The first one is what I would call substantive governance, sort of the goals and the strategies used to promote those goals, what most people think of the law as being. The second one is really procedural governance, which are really the processes used by decision makers to decide what strategies to adopt. And then third, structural governance, sort of the allocation of authority among institutions and how these might be revised or changed, okay? And these are all three different components of governance that are important, but also problematic in this context, okay? So the coordinated framework created in 1986 is the core of the U.S. regulatory system on biotechnology, okay? It's almost 40 years old. Its fundamentals it's been reconsidered a few times, but its fundamentals have largely remained the same, okay? Including that it does not establish any new legal authority for regulating biotechnology, okay? At its heart, it's really what I would call structural governance framework. Okay, it's an interagency framework involving 3 different agencies: EPA, the Office of Chemical Safety and Pollution Prevention; the FDA, Food and Drug Administration; and the USDA's Animal and Plant Health Inspection Service, FSIS, and Agricultural Marketing Service, but really USDA. So you've got 3 agencies: EPA, FDA, USDA. Okay, and depending on its characteristics, Emma sort of alluded to this a little bit, I'm sure many of us are very familiar with it, the biotech product may be regulated by 1 or more of these agencies. But only to the extent that their pre-existing regulatory or statutory authority allows that regulation. Okay? So EPA regulates biotechnology generally only if it can be characterized as a pesticide under FIFRA, which is really the sort of pesticide law, or pesticide chemical residue, or a new microorganism product under either the Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act or TSCA, the Toxic Substance Control Act. The FDA is primarily charged with promoting public health through regulation of food and drug products, including biotech food and drugs under the FFDCA and the Public Health Service Act. And the USDA APHIS is charged with regulating biotech products to the extent that they pose a risk to agricultural, plant, and livestock products, okay? Or veterinary biologics, sort of biopharmaceuticals under the Virus Serum Toxin Act, okay? So that's it, okay? So EPA regulates largely pesticides, FDA regulates food and drugs, USDA regulates agricultural products, okay? That framework, hopefully you can already see right there that there's something unusual or to map onto a concept of, okay, let's think about releasing these into the environment, maybe for conservation purposes, which is where my primary heart and work is, okay? And a lot of people have raised critiques about the coordinated framework. And probably the most common one, many of you have it here, I'm sure, it's been very commonly. It sounded like that was part of the secondary, part of the sort of Asilomar Revisited conference, is that, you know, that the sort of Byzantine nature of the framework, right? That the framework can lead to redundancies and inefficiencies, and that these can raise regulatory barriers that sort of hindering the ability for industry to compete internationally or otherwise, okay? And Republican and Democratic administrations have been somewhat receptive to this perspective, okay, both of them, all right? So in 2022, Biden signed an executive order to promote sort of general development of biotechnology. The executive order was in large part a response to sort of industry concerns, okay? And the idea was to try to coordinate a whole of government approach to advance biotech and biomanufacturing, really particularly in the health and agriculture and energy, with the focus again on products, because that's what the coordinated framework is focused on, okay? And the USDA, EPA, and FDA spent months developing a plan to reform their regulations based on that executive order. It was supposed to be released in December 2024. That never happened. And on March 2025, President Trump, along with 19 or 18 other executive orders, rescinded Biden's executive order. The White House claimed the executive order, quote, funneled federal resources into radical biotech and biomanufacturing initiatives under the guise of environmental policy. Okay, no other explanation. I think my own take is that Biden did it, get rid of it. Okay, I don't think there was much more thought of it than that. But whether we focus on the coordinated framework, Biden's initiative, or Trump's rescission, all of them are really, I think, to me, somewhat unaware of this literature and evidence on public institutional design. They really only focus on one set of structural concerns of biotechnology governance, that this a coordinated framework, sort of fragmented piecemeal approach, which is certainly a valid critique. I'm not trying to say that it's not. It has regulatory redundancies that may or may not be efficient. And sometimes other people counter it, that it has all kinds of regulatory gaps that may fail to regulate some technologies. These are important, but they really are a small fraction of the governance issues, I think, that are really at play here. And I want to really sort of lay out 4 fundamental questions with this governance system that I hope that you at least will think about. The first is also structural. Okay, it's not just about the regulatory efficiencies, that the federal agencies charged with the coordinated framework don't really have focusing in this framework that we're talking about here, they're really being stretched to bring their expertise to bear on these sorts of problems, to try to assess the really broad range of biodiversity and ecological health issues and other sorts of issues that are raised by once you get it out of containment and put it into whatever that else there is. This is no longer just a product, okay? So the FDA may be well equipped to evaluate medicines developed through synthetic biology. I mean, so that's the FDA's bread and butter, drugs, right, food. But there are a lot of environmental risks that the agency isn't well placed to assess, okay? It also doesn't have any existing statutory authority to deny approval because of environmental harms or to consider environmental benefits that are outside of that framework, okay? Same thing, USDA has some expertise in invasive species management. APHIS is the primary agency in charge of that. Their main thing is invasive species, okay? But the focus in its authority has always been on plant pests, okay? That's really what their core focus is. EPA has a lot of expertise in water and air quality, and of course toxics and pesticidal substances, okay? And they've developed expertise to try to deal with some of the things the coordinated framework tries to shoehorn into those categories of pesticides, et cetera. And sort of microorganisms that might qualify as toxic products, okay? But ecology and conservation biology are not really at the core of EPA's mission. Now, many of you may know there's a number of federal agencies that do have expertise in ecology, right? We've got the Fish and Wildlife Service, we've got NOAA Fisheries or National Marine Fisheries Service, you've got the USGS, U.S. Geological Survey, which is really sort of the scientific arm of the Department of Interior, but even to a lesser extent, some of the federal land agencies, including National Park Service, U.S. Forest Service, and BLM, where again, when you're talking about in the context of conservation or releasing things into the environment, they are going to be relevant to the conversation, okay? They're all excluded from the coordinated framework. Never been part of it. And the executive orders that I mentioned before, okay? So this leads to fundamentally more regulatory uncertainty to the extent these agencies have authority, right? Many of these would likely have authority over some applications of synthetic conservation, okay? Or there might be certain concerning regulatory gaps if these agencies are not given any authority to deal with some of the things that we're talking about, okay? So that's the first point I wanted to make, right? That the structural point that the coordinated framework coordinates certain agencies, but doesn't coordinate a bunch of others. And in this when it comes to just products, maybe that might make sense, although many of us would critique it as not making sense. But when you're talking about release, then it becomes a much broader conversation. The coordination doesn't exist with all these other agencies. I'm not even talking about state agencies that might have authority as well. Second, the executive order in no way challenges an implicit substantive assumption of the coordinated framework. Again, I alluded to this before, that biotechnology consists of products, okay? That these products need to be reviewed for safety before being allowed into the market, like a food, like a car or toothpaste. When I say that, I mean it's similar to other kinds of market-based regulation we have. We have many other regulatory regimes that involve market-based regulation, okay? Product regulation, okay? Those tend to focus primarily on, and I think the coordinated framework is this way too, facilitating the entry of products into the marketplace or stopping them from doing so, limiting the risk of those products on human health and environment. That's their focus, on products into the market, okay? But obviously biotechnology in this context encompasses living organisms that unavoidably become part of complex ecosystems over time, with potentially positive effects on biodiversity and ecological health. That's certainly what many of us would want, but also obviously potentially negative risks on them as well, okay? So the assessments that are required under these product regulation regimes are just too narrow. They really don't capture the breadth of risks and advantages for synthetic conservation measures. The FDA, for example, has to treat gene drives as a veterinary measure. And by statute, its regulatory focus must be on limiting harm to the host animal, not thinking about the broader implications of that product. Third, so The risk mitigation by the FDA, USDA, and EPA is focused on, again, minimizing risks of environmental release. That's really where the orientation is. That doesn't make sense in this context for synthetic conservation or what we want to call it now, and what others are bringing it up, right? Where introduction to the environment is, in fact, the purpose of the strategy. That's likely to raise especially acute concerns regarding this kind of conservation, especially risks of irreversibility and the ability to control the intervention. Uncertainty is likely to be particularly confounding. But it's also true that it may have potential benefits, right, in limiting or preventing disease and ecological harm, maybe from climate change, filling an ecological niche, altering nutrient cycles, hopefully for the better, eliminating a disease or a virus, remediating pollution. These make at least a comprehensive assessment of the pros and cons vital. And the coordinated framework, which is what most people are focusing in on, doesn't allow for that, okay? And it's partly because, again, the product regulation approach is only on the initial market entry evaluation. So this means that the regulatory regimes largely ignore the need for ongoing monitoring and adaptive management, what I would call procedural governance, okay? Not just about the substantive or structure, but also about the process for decision-making. It's almost always focused on the initial decision and then very little on monitoring and adaptive management to manage uncertainty in new circumstances. Okay, so for example, APHIS grants a petition for non-regulated status for a transgenic plant. It is no longer has authority over the plant or its progeny, including the monitoring of the plant for unexpected impacts. Okay. Fourth and last, perhaps I think most fundamentally, synthetic conservation raises questions about ethical trade-offs and goals, what I would call, again, substantive governance. Okay, in synthetic conservation, the product is not really the goal of the engineering process. The product is at most a means to the end of, for example, restoring an ecosystem or improving human health or the health of an endangered species, right? So I think it should only be evaluated for its risk, but the end goal itself is worth questioning, okay? The coordinated framework ignores this. It's not intended to deal with this. So it doesn't integrate any of the species and land conservation laws that might speak to this. Okay? But in fact, something that I know a little bit more about even, those natural resource laws also mostly neglect this question. Okay? They largely focus on promoting three different goals. Historical preservation, sort of keeping things as they used to be, without regard to whether it's good or bad. Natural preservation, sort of minimizing human intervention, without regard to harm. And third, sustained yield, sort of maximizing the yield of a particular favored resource like fish or timber, okay? I really think that we need to reconsider these fundamental changes in governance. And this really draws on this literature I was talking about for each of the components of governance. So in substantive governance, the important questions aren't how to leave nature alone or how to put things back the way they were. It's how to manage in a way that promotes future ecosystem function, quality, ecosystem health. Does the strategy, as compared to alternative strategies, promote biodiversity or ecological health in light of current and reasonably foreseeable ecological conditions? But even if everyone in this room or in the world agreed with that approach, which of course is not going to happen, it still raises some pretty fundamental questions, okay? What do we mean by biodiversity? What do we mean by ecological health? It could mean any of different things. I'm sure many of you know better than I do. It could be maximizing biomass, productivity, genetic species, or ecosystem diversity. It could draw on indigenous conceptions of value. These raise fundamental, underexplained, underexplored questions regarding value that are really at the heart of what we're doing here. How to value and choose among different ecosystem functions. There's not been discussion or study regarding how to measure or reconcile these many values or trade-offs. And I put it to you that this should be a major focus of conservation science. It's easy for me to say because I'm not a scientist, right? Secondly, a procedural governance. I mentioned this before, I won't go over it too much. Basically, conventional procedures aren't especially adaptive when considering the level of uncertainty. Okay, they still rely on pretty static processes where they're primarily front-end planning that assumes agencies can and should focus most of their attention and resources on the initial decision. that are only rarely revisited to account for new information or changed circumstances. Now, there's been some movement in other regulatory contexts involving integration of contingency planning and adaptive management, but effective adaptive processes are really the exception still across the regulatory context in many different regulatory spheres. Again, in structural governance, I rate substantive, procedural, not structural governance. The framework does do a structural approach, but it coordinates only some of the regulators and excludes others. There's so much to pull from the institutional design literature that doesn't seem to be in the conversation. We need to explore ways that institutional design might be changed. It's not just, coordination is different than centralization. They're two fundamentally different axes of authority. Even if we did, overlapping authority in some contexts can be valuable, but not so much in others. We can rely on, there are many different forms of coordination when we talk about coordination. Anything from just talking to each other to allowing for veto power by one agency or another. These all have trade-offs, not part of the conversation. And these trade-offs will differ depending on what governmental function we're talking about, whether we're talking about monitoring, whether we're talking about standard setting, whether we're talking about permitting, enforcement, monitoring, compliance monitoring, funding. All right, I'll stop. So I'm happy to elaborate a lot more on many of these different ideas, but I think I just wanted to provoke and think about that these different forms of governance really really need to be part of the conversation. And it's really interesting, I think, a really interesting part of the thing to happen, and I'm glad to hear that this is hopefully going to be happening here. So thank you.